Hey guys, we are back updating the power rankings for Survivor 48 following episode 5, the final episode of the pre-merge, and this was obviously a very interesting episode for a variety of reasons, both gameplay-wise and otherwise, but we'll get to that soon enough. But we have 14 people to talk about, and let's waste some more time. Let's go right into the video. So starting off at number 14, we have the latest boo from the season, and here we have Bianca. And Bianca's someone who I was obviously very low on for pretty much the back half of the pre-merge here, where while there was a point where I was semi-high on her, I feel like at the point where Thomas went out, I feel like I was pretty much out on her. And this was kind of a weird episode for her where, on one hand, there was a lot of setup to her going out here where she got a lot of focus early on, talking about how she lost her vote, and that was such a big talking point for her across the episode that it just made it pretty clear that it was going to come into play in some fashion. And sure enough, it eventually culminated in her telling Cedric before Tribal that she had in fact lost her vote. But on the other hand, I was sort of struggling to figure out how it would make sense practically for Bianca to go out, considering it doesn't really make much sense for the two sides, the Siva and the Vula sides, to come at it 2-2, even though it's technically the last round before the merge. And obviously by the end, all the setup to Bianca, like, not having her vote ultimately culminated in her downfall here. So it was kind of a weird thing where I wasn't entirely sure how the Bianca boo was going to happen, even though there was definitely set up for it to happen. And again, talking about Bianca more generally, she is someone who I was kind of mixed on coming to the season. And I feel like once the season started, I feel like there was a little point in the season where I thought she had an outside chance. But after episode 3, I was pretty much out on her. And even if she had survived this round, I wasn't going to feel great about her anyway. But obviously, she is now out of the game to where she's here at number 14. And with that, we have 13 people left in the game to talk about. As usual, I'll be ranking them based on how likely I think they are to win the game based on their edit and current game position. And I'll say straight up that I am expecting the Mergatory episode next week to be a very important episode for the course of the season. And through that, it wouldn't shock me if next week's rankings end up being quite a bit different compared to last week's, as we literally saw last season that the start of the merge was really this big turning point for Rachel, who ended up winning the season, who I felt like had a very lackluster edit in the pre-merge, but then really turned it on at the point the merge started. And it wouldn't shock me if we end up getting the same thing again, and we end up having some new contenders after this next week's episode, but I'm still going to run through this based off what we currently have. But number 13, the person I believe is the least likely to win coming into Mergatory is Cedric. And Cedric has been in such a weird spot for a lot of the season from an edit perspective, where you can very clearly tell that he is an important player on the season, where this is now the second tribal where he's attended, where he's been a critical vote in what's happened. Where in this episode, he was such a big swing vote over what was going to happen here, literally having Bianca's game in his hands. And despite this, he gets another very lackluster edit, where he doesn't really get any confessionals until the actual scramble, but even then, he talks about being on the fence about it. And the fact that we don't really get much of Cedric's perspective coming into the vote, and his entire decision to vote out Bianca is another puzzling one, is obviously a knock against his game there. Now, you can definitely argue that he definitely should have kept Say around, considering that Say is technically someone who was on his original tribe, but even then, Say is someone who very openly is undermining him, and the fact that Cedric is keeping her around is also not particularly great there. So it's sort of weird because Cedric is someone who, on paper, should be in a pretty good spot from game precision, where there are just so many people that want to work with him, but then he just comes and votes them out, where we saw this with Justin, where Justin really trusted him for a lot of the game, but then he just votes him out because Justin had lied to him about not having a vote. And then you have, in this episode, Bianca telling him, confiding in him even, right before Tribal, that she doesn't have a vote. And then he just decides to go straight to Chrissy and Mitch to come up with this plan to vote Bianca out instead, and keeping Say around, someone who doesn't really trust him that much. So it is really baffling how Cedric continues to make these strategic faux pas across the season. And on top of that, he's just not a focus in the edit, even though he has so many excuses to get more content. And the fact that he's not getting more is such a big knock to me that I had to leave him here at the very bottom. So because of that, he is here at number 13. Now moving on to number 12, and we have another person who has continued to go downhill after this episode. And here we have Charity. And Charity got another pretty bad episode here, where you have her tribe end up winning this reward, and you have her like on the reward talking about how it's great and everything. But then the show literally goes out of its way to showcase Eva dunking on her, where you have Eva talking about how Charity is fake and that she can't be trusted. And the fact that they just thrust this upon us with no real setup, and there was just no reason to show Eva dunking on Charity in this spot is a really bad sign for Charity here. And truth be told, at this point, I think Charity's probably the next boot. I could very easily see Charity being the merge boot here, and considering just how her edit has been increasingly negative over the course of the pre-merge, it's just such a bad look for me. And the fact that the negative content she got in this episode was unnecessary. The show went out of its way to show Eva dunking on Charity. All of it's really bad. No way Charity's winning. And I think I'm going to be talking about Charity as being the boot next week. So it's for that reason that I have her really low here at number 12. Now moving on to number 11, and we have the person who I've had at the bottom for a lot of the season, but this ended up being a decent episode for them, and here we have Star. And I do think Star is on the uptick a little bit, where she got a pretty good episode here. Now mind you, she doesn't get a confessional until after the immunity challenge, and even then you can argue that's circumstantial, where you have the tribe helping her find the Beware advantage and finding that, and then you have her talking about how she wants to work with Eva now, which is obviously a turnaround there. So it's definitely a positive sign for Star, and definitely an indication that she could be around the game a bit longer, though at the same time, I feel like it's just too little too late. And while you could argue that the merge is going to be like this big turning point in the story, and through that Star could be a bigger role within that, I feel like the stuff that we got up to this point is just not enough to me. And even with her content about wanting to work with Eva, I feel like that's a bigger positive for Eva than it is for Star. So I'm still not feeling that great about Star, but at the end of the day, this was still a positive episode for Star. Definitely enough to have her above the people we already talked about. So because of that, I do have her here at number 11. Now moving on to number 10, and we have someone who I am still pretty low on, but this technically was not a bad episode for them. But at number 10, we do have Chrissy. And admittedly, this episode didn't move the needle for Chrissy. I still don't think she's winning. And I feel like this episode just saw her like carrying out her strategy of wanting to pick up the loggies, where she goes all in on targeting Bianca in this round. Mind you, we got the scene earlier in the episode about Chrissy and Mitch wanting to work with Bianca, though it did seem like the target did shift very late, where I wouldn't be surprised if it came out that the reason why they decided to go all in on targeting Bianca here is due to Cedric telling them that Bianca didn't have a vote there. So obviously that's something to consider, though you also have the fact that Chrissy was the target for Bianca in this round over Mitch, and obviously that's not great either from a gameplay perspective. But really this episode just didn't really change much for me. I was already pretty low on Chrissy. I just don't think she's winning, and this episode didn't really change that view for me. So because of that, I do over here on number 10. Now moving on to number 9, and we have another person who's remaining around the same spot compared to last week, and here we have Say. And Say is, once again, around a similar spot game-wise and edit-wise, where she is a pretty big character once again, and a bit of a villainous one, where a big moment for her comes after the reward challenge, where she calls out Mary for gloating about winning the reward challenge, and you have other people back at camp talking about how Say's a sore loser. You also have Bianca talking in her exit interview about how people in the other tribes are annoyed by Say, so I feel like there's a lot of not great stuff that came out from Say in this episode. I feel like this episode didn't really paint her in that great of a light. And then obviously you have her being a target, or at least talked about as a target during this round, even though it ended up not panning out that way by the end of it. But really, this episode didn't change my view about Say, just confirmed things that I felt about her before. She's not winning, which is why she's here at number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and we have another person who I remain unchanged on after this episode. This episode just really solidified my view on them even more, and here we have Kyle. And Kyle's someone who definitely should be higher, and definitely should be more of an important character on this season, where yes, he does get to talk in this episode about how he and Camila survived the latest tribal, how it was a masterclass, but then you have this really pivotal scene that happens after the reward challenge where we see the new Vula tribe built bonding and sharing their stories and then ultimately deciding to stick together. And the fact that Kyle is the only person on that tribe to not get to share his story at all is really bad, and Kyle is just completely overshadowed in that scene. And it's just a really big indication to me that he's just not going to be that important to this alliance, where this alliance should be something that if it ends up being important to the game later on, that if Kyle were the winner, that he would at least get some perspective on this, either sharing a story that he has, or at least getting confessional talking about how this alliance is good for his game. But the fact that he gets nothing here, and the fact that Camila and Shaheen end up getting way more to do in the formation of this new alliance, and this big personal scene for this entire tribe, just really screams out to me that Kyle's only being shown when it's absolutely necessary, and through that, he's not a contender. He's not winning the season, which is why he's here at number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and this person has actually gone down compared to last week, as I feel like this was a very questionable episode for this person, and here we have Mary. And I don't think this was a particularly good episode for Mary, where obviously her big moment comes after the reward challenge, where she ends up gloating to the other tribes, talking about how their tribe is stacked and how they just dominated and how great the reward is, only for Say to call her out for being a sore winner. And while there is some negativity thrown to Say by others calling Say a sore loser, you also have Mary's own tribemates calling her out for the fact that she was gloating and how it just paints a bigger target on their backs. And the fact that Mary doesn't really get to defend herself in this spot, where Mary could have gotten a confessional talking about how it was either a mistake for her to be boastful like that, or for her to at least talk about it in a positive light, is obviously a major missed opportunity here. I feel like Mary could definitely defended herself a bit better, and the fact that the episode just kind of left it at that is probably a bad sign for Mary moving forward. Though at the same time, I feel like the stuff that she's got before this point was definitely better than the people that are lower on this list, though at the end of the day, I feel like this is still not a great look for Mary, which is why she's here at number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and this person has also gone down slightly compared to last week, and here we have Mitch. And this was kind of a weird episode for Mitch, where he had definitely got some strategic content early on, talking about how with the fact that Thomas went out of the game, lowered the necessity to take out Bianca, where their initial plan was to weaken Loggy, but now that Loggy's already lost a member, that's not as important. And he talks quite a bit about wanting to work with Bianca in this spot, and we even have Bianca talking in her exit interview about how she was really close to Mitch as well. But then all that just culminates in Mitch not getting his way. Now, yes, he does technically vote for Say in this spot. However, I think when you really look at it, I think Mitch was definitely aware about the Bianca blindside, that he was just throwing his vote on the Say in case Bianca had an idol of some sort. But at the end of the day, I feel like Mitch is still someone that went along with this plan, even though he technically didn't vote for Say. And to me, that's a pretty bad look. The fact that he talks about wanting to work with Bianca, only for that to lead to nothing by the end of it, that's not particularly great. And obviously, there's a reason why I have moved Mitch down compared to last week. Though at the same time, I feel like there's still enough there to where he can maybe recover at the Mergatory round, but I feel like I'm probably higher on other people at this point, which is why he's here at number 6. Now moving on to number 5, and this person is someone who went down quite a lot after last week, but I feel like this was a good enough rebound for them, and here we have Shaheen. And Shaheen is someone who I had written off after last week's episode. I feel like last week was a very bad look for him, with him basically getting the bulk of the blame for the California girls falling apart. But I feel like this episode was a good rebound for him, where he gets a scene at the beginning of the episode talking about how he was blindsided and how the California girls didn't even last one tribal. But then by the end of this episode, he actually ends up getting a new alliance, this being the new Vula tribe. And he does also get to share his personal story, talking about his parents and really being part of that scene, which I think is pretty good there. And I do think this was a fine enough recovery for Shaheen. And with this coming right before Mergatory, I can see a world where Shaheen is able to build upon this, where maybe the Mergatory episode is him expanding upon this new alliance. This could be the start of his new story. And through that, Shaheen could rise up in the future. I do feel like this was a good enough episode to where I am, once again, willing to move Shaheen into contention, though at the same time, I'm definitely higher in the top 4 at this current point, which is why he's here at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and this is another person that has been creeping up in the rankings over time, but number 4 we do have David. And David is someone who I have been growing on a little bit as the season has been going along, and I feel like this was another fun enough episode for him where he gets a funny scene during the reward talking about how his love for milk and how he needs to have milk every day. And while it's not too much beyond that, where his only other confessional comes during the Search for Stars for Aware advantage, I do think David is someone who's definitely meant to be this rootable figure at this point, definitely someone who's meant to be this fan favorite. Mind you, I don't think there's much for him to actually go on to win unless he really pivots in the Mergatory episode and beyond. But I feel like David is definitely someone to be looking out for, someone who is meant to be this fan favorite. It's for the reason that I bumped him up here to number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and we have another person who has been creeping up over time, and here we have Camila. And I thought this was another decent episode for Camila, where she really gets to build upon her story from last episode of how she ended up outsmarting the California girls and pulling in a blindside there. But I think the other thing to point out is her involvement in the scene where the Vulas decide to sit together, where I feel like Camilla's the one who got the most focus during that scene of talking about her background and her parents, and also talking about how this was a very good bonding experience and that in turn led to the creation of this new alliance. And I feel like if this alliance ends up sticking, if this alliance ends up being a major focus in the future, I think Camila, along with Shaheen, would inherit a lot of the credit for that. And I feel like that's all pretty good there. And obviously, that's a major reason why I have bumped up on Camila over time. Though at the same time, I'm still questioning whether she's just going to be like this big player this season. And I feel like with the rest of her pre-merge being kind of fine, but nothing elite, nothing like too complex, I feel like I couldn't quite have Camila at the very top of the list, but at the end of the day, I feel like Camila is still someone to be looking out for, someone who's definitely a contender at this point, which is why she's here at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and it is the same top 2 as last week, and I did have a debate here over what the order was coming into it. However, I think considering just what happened this episode and for other reasons, I did decide to bump this person down, and at number 2, we do have Joe. And I think the tough thing with Joe is that he got 0 confessionals in this episode, which I wasn't really expecting. I said last week that I felt like last week's episode was good for him, where even though he was blindsided and even though it was a bad game outcome for him, he was shielded from that, where he didn't get as much focus. And that was a way to not really give Joe the blame for causing Thomas to go off, to really bungle this round. And I thought at the time that Joe was going to get to respond to that, where he would have talked after the tribal, talking about how they really messed up and how they need to like recover moving forward, how they're now at the bottom. But he doesn't really get that at all, which I found very strange there. And yes, while he is involved during the scene where the Vulas come together, and he also gets to talk about his parents, he does get to weigh in on that, getting personal content there. I feel like he was definitely overshadowed by Camila and Shaheen in that regard, which I didn't love there. And then you have, like, obviously his scene during the immunity challenge where he helps calm Eva down, which is obviously something that was foreshadowed in the premiere, where Eva was outlining to Joe what he needs to do to calm her down and the signs that she is getting overstimulated. And obviously that pays off here, but he also gets no confessionals during that either. Like, you would think, like, on the scene where they're coming out of the challenge, or heck, even having a post-immunity scene at the Vula camp, that Joe would have weighed in on that. But no, he doesn't get any confessionals there either. So that's at least 3 opportunities where Joe could have gotten more of a chance to weigh in through a confessional, but he doesn't get that, which I find super perplexing. I thought Joe was going to have, like, this bigger episode this week, considering everything that was going on here. But at the same time, I still think Joe is definitely the main character this season. I think he's definitely the biggest rooting interest. I think we're supposed to come out of this episode looking at Joe very positively, where he obviously is part of this scene where he's bonding with his tribe mates. He is obviously a major focus during the Eva moment in this episode. I still think we're meant to be looking at Joe as like this big character of the season. And through that, I would expect Joe to remain a contender. And while he does get 0 confessionals in this episode, I don't think it's enough to knock him below this point, as I still think there's a world where he can go on to win at this point. But at the same time, I still have to knock him a little bit for the fact that he got no confessionals. It's kind of hard to have him at number 1 when he got no confessionals in this episode, especially with the circumstances surrounding it. So while I am going to bump him down this week, it wouldn't shock me if he has a good episode in the merge that causes him to spike back up. But for now, considering everything I just mentioned, I do have to have him here at number 2. And now, at number 1, the person I believe is the most likely to win Survivor 48 coming into the merge is Eva. And honestly, I did not want to have Eva at number 1 for obvious reasons. I felt like it would have been kind of a cop-out, if I'm being honest. And even now, like, I'm still like on the fence over whether Eva is actually going to win. I said at the beginning of the video that I'm expecting the merge to be like this big turning point in the season where the true contenders are going to start to shine. And whether Eva is going to be one of those contenders remains to be seen. And then obviously you have the fact that she got so much focus in this episode, a lot of it being stuff that was always going to happen regardless due to the nature of the show and considering what happens here. And obviously that was a big factor in all this. How to really assess this in terms of what Eva's winner chances. Though I think after thinking about it, I still think this was a good episode for Eva's chances here. Now, she does get content before the immunity challenge talking about how Charity's fake and how she wants to target Charity next. And considering how I feel like Charity is being pretty primed to be the Mergatory boot, I feel like that's definitely a good setup to Eva getting credit for that move. So I feel like that's something there. You obviously have the entire scene where she has a meltdown during the challenge. She gets like overstimulated. And then she ends up coming out to the entire cast, which is obviously a pretty big moment here. And obviously the moment that everyone seems to be talking about. And I already gave my personal thoughts on the entire situation. I made an entire separate video, so I don't have to waste time in this one breaking it down. But obviously, that's something to consider here. I don't really factor it too much into my assessment of her winning chances, as at the end of the day, it was always going to be on the show, whether Eva's a winner or not. Though I will say that from a pure game perspective, I do think it is a slight negative in the sense that Eva's now going to be looked at as this pretty big threat, especially with what happens after the immunity challenge, where she ends up playing a role in helping Star find the Beware-Venge, and then after Star gets the idol, she just gives it to Eva in front of everyone. So now not only do people know about Eva's background, but also they know that Eva has an idol coming to the merge, and they probably also know that Eva and Joe are really close. So I feel like those things are probably not great from a game perspective and will definitely be knocks against her later on in the game. But I still walk away from this episode feeling good about Eva from an editor perspective, where even in the scene after the challenge, you have Star talking about how she understands Eva better and now she wants to work with her, which I think is a positive there. And I feel like if we are going along this line of the new era winners facing fake adversity, you can definitely argue that Star targeting Eva in the pre-merge was that adversity, and now she's overcome it, and now she can really ride into the merge, like, being able to, like, have a more traditional winner's edit. So I feel like even with this episode, even with everything that's happened, I'm still going to look at this as a net positive. Now, obviously, next week could change things. Next week could definitely see new people emerge, and you can definitely argue that Eva should not be number one based off what's already happened, but I feel like considering where we're currently at, I feel like I kind of have to have Eva at number one, even though I'm still not that secure about it. But for now, she's here at number one. And there we go. That will do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe. Really helps with the channel. Now we'll be back again next week, update the Power Rankings again, so you can look forward to that. I'm covering Australian Survivor as well as The Amazing Race, so be on the lookout for videos on those shows. I'm on Patreon and have a YouTube membership, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description. And you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that is the video. See ya.